My name is Michael O'Halloran. Like every other Australian, we came from overseas somewhere along the line, and because you have very many, entries in the family tree, the longest we can go back to is a convict that came out here 5 years after the original settlement. And like all the other convicts that came out, it was for such an insignificant crime, but of course they were then sentenced to death. He came out here and as a result formed his own career and developed a family from there. It was interesting to see what actually happened with most of the convicts. Something like 80% of them stayed with other convicts and as a result got nowhere, but it was that last 20% that took advantage of an opportunity that was never available in England and was able to create a whole new life for themselves. And I'm a descendant from one of those. The name changes several times, and it's interesting that even with my great-grandfather coming out from Ireland, they changed the name of the spelling of his surname because most people didn't have any documentation, and it was more of a mismatch of everything. So you didn't get one particular type of race, but they really, from what I understand and reading the documentation, they really had it hard. When they arrived out here, it was 40 degrees and they were never used to that sort of thing. It was situations where there was never enough food, and it was really the resilient ones that survived. And so I guess the first Australians who came out here were really a strong body of people, because if they weren't and they couldn't put up with all this, they didn't survive at all. And it was only the strong ones who managed to make a life out of it. And as a result, I think that's done a lot for the nature of the Australians. And of course then the last part was, because it was so hard, the population, and this is something I was getting from there, seemed to combine together, and there's this mateship that's been going on for hundreds of years, and that's something that has been prevalent in Australia for a long, long time now, probably because you had no choice. You relied on your next door neighbour to help you through. Anyone who has a bit of an Irish extraction somewhere along to like to relate to that, because of this. It's just such a mystical thing we learn about Ireland, and because they're such a fun-loving race of one form or another, especially if you go over there. So everybody relates to some portion. Yes, you are Australian, you're all Australian, but you do look back at, and it's becoming more and more popular, especially with all these websites that allow you to find your ancestor, and everybody wants to see the original connection to the extent they do DNA now. So you want to find something that is a little bit different. And so the Greeks in particular, the third generation Greek now considers himself Greek, whereas the second generation Greek would always consider themselves Australian. And I grew up with a lot of people who were very, very strong saying, I'm an Australian. Of course, their children now keep saying, oh, but I'm Greek. And so to a certain extent, yes, I'm Irish. We've been back to where the family tree started and everything else like that. But when you boil it right down, I will always be Australian. My children will always be Australian. But you like to have this little bit extra, to be a little bit different from everybody else. The interesting thing was my grandmother. My grandmother came from a different area that we're used to. So she would have grown up when the war was on, First World War. So her husband was in his late 30s when he joined up, World War I. He died, unfortunately, within a year, and so my grandmother had to remarry. Unfortunately, in those days, there were very few men around, so she dropped her age by 10 years and pretended she was then only 26, and she married somebody who was 22. Remember, she was 32. So she dropped by a bit and got him to put his age up, so a bit different too. My grandmother was a very vain person, to us, she was granny, she was the loveliest thing, but then she was so particular about anybody finding all these details out. Eventually she divorced this gentleman, but grandmother had all these hidden stories, and we didn't even know about how her grandfather died in Gallipoli because that was considered taboo. And nowadays it was something you'd be very, very proud of. But in those days, she was just pretend it didn't happen, and she had to change her name by default again to kind of move into the next generation and where she's living after that. So she was a bit of the dark horse in the family. Everybody else has been very, very conservative. But to a youngster, of course, your grandmother is always the most perfect person there. But you always had that little history of, I wonder what she got up to when she was young as well. But then again, it's a different life. What we put up with today. For instance, in the town they were in, Carcoar, there was only 3 cars. And so you didn't have electricity, you didn't have transport, you didn't have all the things that we're so used to. So life would have had to be different. And therefore the reputation of each of the neighbours was very, very important, whereas today nobody cares. Whereas to her in those days, yes. So there's a lot of dark secrets in the family there. I guess what I'd like to talk about, and we're very privileged of this, was the sacrifices that our forefathers, even to my parents, made to get to the particular lifestyle we have at the moment. I don't think that the children will appreciate how hard it was in previous generations. I mean, my children knew, and my grandchildren have known my father, but they didn't understand all the, sacrifices he had to make. And to them, automatically assumed that everything was going very easy. And that because Pa was very relaxed and had everything at the end of the life, but he didn't have that in the beginning. And I remember when I was 5 years old, he went overseas to increase his education. He was a doctor, but it was the only thing he could do, and he was away for 2 years, and so Mum had 4 boys to bring up on her own, and it was hard. But these sort of things today's generation don't know about, because they see everybody else having their own houses, their own cars and things like that, and it didn't happen in my day, or my parents' day anyway. You can talk about a glass being half empty or a glass being half full. We have enough opportunity here to make whatever we want to make and to do whenever we want to do. It is becoming harder for the young people out of school now to get a house to live in, and that's the only concern, because it just seems to be getting impossible. But everything else, the climate, the way of life, the attitude of the population themselves, seems to be comparable to anywhere else in the world. We have what I class as a free society here, where we are not really facing the dangers that other countries are facing at the moment. We are so safe because we're a long way away from everywhere. But it's always the attitude of the individual. If he seems to think that the world is falling apart, then by looking at all the media and things like that, then he'll believe it. But if you think you've got the opportunity, it's just so good. And you just have to take advantages of what is around Australia. I mean, we do have such a diverse country, and it's easy to get to the different places. And so I, in some ways, envy my children coming through, because they have more opportunity to learn and find out what's going on than we did. I mean, we didn't have, when I was first growing up, television, we didn't have the internet. So the information that's now available to them was never available to us. And so they become a lot more educated, and therefore they can make a lot of smarter decisions than we could. But going back to on the other side, of course, it's always a bit of fun where you have to work it out yourself. And they don't have the same joys that we had when we first travelled, where you get to a country and they wouldn't speak English, and you didn't have credit cards, you only had some cash or traveller's cash, and you had to make good. And unfortunately, because of all the internets and everything else, so that all the mystique of that has gone away. But it's a lot easier to get to, but you've lost the opportunity for the excitement and the potential dangers of going to another country. and I persuaded my sons to travel as soon as they got out of school to learn a little bit more. Now it's too late because it's just too easy. They all worked over in London or worked in Europe, and they really enjoyed it because it was so different. But nowadays, it's a global world, and we just don't have that, different nationalities anymore because it's all one big melting pot, and that's what it is in Australia. So when I was growing up, we didn't have any Asians at all, not very many Greeks and Italians, and therefore our food was rather bland. We thought it was good because it was wholesome. But now, because of all the immigration, I mean, the most amazing foods are now available. And my children grandchildren in particular, take it for granted. Whereas it's something that we've learned to enjoy. And that's part of the, the globalization we've got at the moment. That they didn't have the opportunity in going away somewhere else to all of a sudden getting this raw fish in a place called Japan, where you could never understand anything written down because there's no English. And you want to get a train, you had to look at these symbols. A symbol like a house falling over or a bit of tree growing up there, and that was the station that you had to get off. That's one of the things I think they're going to miss out on. But on the other side, they've got all this other information we never had.